The Liberal victory in Ottawa has certainly brought a bit of a gloomy cloud over Alberta. And joining us to chat about this is Tyler Dawson, our legislative reporter and the National Post's Alberta correspondent. Good to have you with us, Tyler.
Thanks for having me back.
So you've seen a lot of smiles in Alberta this morning? Maybe not so much, right?
Well, in my riding, actually, at Edmonton Centre, there's probably some pretty happy people here. Sent another Liberal to Ottawa, but down your way, I expect not so much.
Yeah, exactly. Lots of disappointment here for sure. A bit of anger as well. So we'll see, if that simmers down or not. Premier Danielle Smith calling for a reset in relations with the federal government. So what does that mean exactly?
Yeah, it's a bit hard to say. I mean, we had a few weeks ago, maybe a month or so ago, when Danielle Smith met with Mark Carney for the first time, and sort of in those, that strange sort of intervening week or two there when he was prime minister. And she put out sort of a list of 9 demands, 9 policies basically that she wanted to see Ottawa change. A lot of them were sort of energy related, but there was also, the single-use plastics ban, some stuff like that. So I think that's probably what she means when she talks about a reset, is hoping that there's going to be some movement from the federal government on some of these issues that are of particular concern to the Alberta government and probably to Alberta voters as well. I mean, I think it's relatively fair to say that Alberta voters, broadly speaking, sort of rejected the Liberals. I mean, I think you maybe had 27-28% of the popular vote went to the Liberals in Alberta here, and pretty much the bulk of the rest of it went to the Conservatives. A few points here and there for the NDP, because I think they walked away with 1 seat in Edmonton Strathcona.
Yeah. Rachel Notley's overriding, so yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, a pretty resounding rejection, I think it's fair to say, of the Carney Liberals from most quarters in Alberta. So, what is that going to look like? I mean, it's hard to say, especially because, we don't know yet how this minority parliament's going to work out in Ottawa. It's the Liberals are quite close to a majority, I think 3 or 4 seats away, but the Conservatives are trailing them by not that much. And then you've got a very diminished group of New Democrats and a modest group of Bloc Québécois MPs. So how does this shake out? Who holds the balance of power? If it's the Bloc Québécois, that puts Alberta perhaps in not a great spot for getting some of the things done that it wants. So in terms of that reset, in terms of the relationship, I think it's going to be Mark Carney's ability to reset that relationship or change the tone, I think is perhaps going to be reduced depending on which party he's depending on to keep his government propped up.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I mean, Mark Carney saying, of course, unity is a big thing here right now. He wants to put that as priority. Okay, how do you do that exactly? I would suggest he probably should visit Premier Danielle Smith soon. He's talking about, setting up a meeting. He made a call, of course, to Trump. So maybe he needs to, pop by and have a coffee, go to an Oilers game together. I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll certainly see some of that. I think, and this is not a criticism of Premier Smith. I mean, is there anything that a federal government could do that is going to appease Alberta to some extent? I think that's a little bit the tricky situation that Carney finds himself in, especially considering that he has pretty close to a majority government with support sort of across the country. I mean, how do you balance some of those regional priorities, right? I mean, if you have Liberal MPs from Quebec who, don't want to see a pipeline running from Alberta through to Quebec, and Alberta does. I mean, how do you balance those regional priorities and some of those regional tensions? I mean, I think that part of the gambit that the Alberta government has made here is saying that we want all of these things or crisis will ensue. That's putting a pretty high bar. That's putting a pretty big offer, pretty big sort of opening negotiation on the table. And so what does the federal government respond with? How does the Alberta government respond to that, right? So I think that certainly there are some meetings that can happen, some discussions that can happen that might sort of bring down the temperature a little bit. But at the end of the day, I think it's a really challenging position for the federal government to address some of those concerns when, of course, they're the government of the whole country, not just Alberta. So I think it's sticky, and I think the outcome of this probably no matter what is we're going to see some sort of resurgence in sort of Western alienation. Perhaps that'll morph into some sort of separatist sentiment, that sort of thing. Whether that goes anywhere, of course, is another question.
Yeah, and that has heated up here. Somebody actually just told me this morning that there was a large increase. They're just seeing this in social media in numbers signing up for an Alberta separation petition that's going around. And I know, yeah, somebody contacted me a while back saying, "Hey, would you sign this?" You know. So what are you hearing? Are Albertans serious about separation?
Well, there's always been a small but noisy cohort of Albertans who are sort of pretty fervent separatists, and they've never really had any true success. There was a single separatist MLA elected in, I think, 1982 in a by-election, and then he promptly lost in the general election like 6 weeks later. They've never held electoral power. They've never managed to come forward with anything, even approaching a referendum. What you do have is a much larger cohort of people who are angry, sort of broadly speaking. I mean, if you look at the polling data, you've got, well, they're big numbers of people who feel disrespected by Ottawa and by the rest of the country, somewhere in sort of the 30 to 60% range. And it's heavily partisan. The partisan affiliations really matter here. New Democrat voters are a lot less likely to be angry about Alberta's place within Canada compared to UCP voters. But what does seem to be, well, there's two things happening right now. I mean, the first is that you do have a little bit more coordination, perhaps, than you have in the past. You have a couple people who are sort of slowly becoming involved in this, who are relatively skilled organizers. They're not just, sort of angry folks with a bunch of trucks driving around. That could make something of a difference. And of course, you have the potential for a citizen-led referendum on this because of changes. Well, it's an older piece of legislation, but there's going to be updates to this piece of legislation that makes it a little bit more easier for citizens to bring forward a referendum on any given question, which of course could include a separation referendum.
Yeah, tell us a bit about that, right? I think this is called the Citizens Initiative Act. I know the Premier is talking about it today. Basically, the numbers get reduced quite a bit as to how many people you need to line up, right?
That's right. So this is part of for referendum purposes, but also recall elections, actually, and so both thresholds have been reduced. But in the case of the referendum, what the old rules, or what the current rules are until the new legislation passes, is that you need 20% of all eligible voters representing 2/3 of ridings in Alberta. And they need to be in-person signatures, and they need to be collected over, I believe it's 60 or 90 days. Right. So relatively tight time period, relatively tricky to get.
Pretty hard to do.
Yeah, well, I mean, that would, sort of objectively be, I mean, it's got to be a couple 100,000 signatures that you'd have to get. So that would be a real challenge. Now, the changes that are being proposed, I believe, are bringing it down to 10% of all people who voted in the previous election. And the time period has been extended as well by, I believe, 30 or 60 days. So the threshold's basically reduced. I mean, that's still a big ask. If you've got, 200,000, say, eligible voters in Alberta, well, it'd be more than that. It'd be 2 million probably about. So you still need a couple 100,000 signatures to make that happen. So still a big ask, still a challenge to do, but certainly an order of magnitude less than it was.
And do those have to be in-person signatures, or can they be online?
I think they do. I'm quite sure they do need to be in-person signatures. And I think there's a little bit of logic to that in the sense that, then you've got sort of identifiable people as opposed to, if you have a change.org petition, how do you know that someone's an Albertan versus in Saskatchewan or Ontario?
Well, I'll be talking with somebody from the Alberta Prosperity Project later this week. So I believe Jeff Rath. So I'll ask him on some of those things. How doable they think it is. So we'll see where it goes. I think the last survey ever I saw on that was as high as 38% of Albertans saying they would be willing to secede and so forth. But again, easier said than done. But I can see right now if they catch the wave, of anger that's there right now, maybe something could happen. So we'll see. Now, these amendments that you're talking about also, you're saying change a few things about Alberta elections, including a ban on electronic vote tabulators. So things have to be counted by hand. I don't have a huge problem with that, but your thoughts there?
Well, so this was I believe it was an election promise that the UCP made back in 2023, and it came up. It's come up at least the last UCP convention, maybe the one before it as well. Just there's some concern, essentially, at the grassroots that electronic voting could be compromised in some fashion. So whatever it is, what it is, the votes are going to get counted. It'll be slower. It'll as all of us journalists came off a very late night on Monday, perhaps we are less enthusiastic about hand counting than everybody else. I mean, that fundamentally would be the biggest change here, is that it would just be a much longer, slower election night counting these things. The other change, which is potentially more significant for the sort of population as a whole, is going to be changes to the corporate and union donations, which at present are banned in Alberta politics. They're also banned in federal elections as well. So if these changes come into effect, you'll basically have reasonably big money back in Alberta politics. You'll have corporations and unions able to donate to individual candidates, to constituency associations, to parties, things like that. So I mean, at the end of the day, that tends to be a matter of perspective, where how one sort of gauges spending versus free speech, but certainly could change the composition. And even you think about the advertising spend that becomes possible with the things.
It does impact it'll be very interesting to see. There's pros and cons to that for sure. Okay, the Alberta government also announcing the Alberta is calling bonus. Now that's a $5,000 credit, I believe, for skilled workers who come here, and that apparently is starting up pretty soon as well. Can you explain just briefly how that works and what they're hoping to accomplish with that?
Yeah, so they'd announced the program. It must have been last year, and what is open now is applications to sort of receive that credit. So the idea was basically that there's a shortage, there is perhaps a shortage of skilled tradespeople in Alberta. There's certainly not a shortage, I think, compared to some other provinces in the country. But at any rate, given the sort of composition of our economy, there's been this desire to bring in skilled labor, skilled tradespeople, things like that. And so the idea was, if those people would relocate to Alberta, they would get a tax credit on their Alberta taxes when they paid them for their first year. And there were some conditions. They had to be here for a year beforehand, I think, or be here for a year before they could claim it, things like that. So applications are basically open. So we'll start seeing some of the data on that after tax season, I believe, just to find out how many people actually took the province up on that offer. So it's kind of interesting, though, in the context of, there's this whole Alberta is calling campaign to begin with, and then this was just sort of another facet of it. But of course, if people recall last summer, there ended up being a bit of a controversy about that when people sort of looked at the number of people coming to Alberta, the impact that was having on some public services and housing and stuff like that. So the government finds itself in a bit of a catch-22 here, right? I mean, more people coming, more skilled workers coming is generally good for the economy. Perhaps not necessarily always in the short term, but certainly in the medium long term, population growth is a positive. But it causes these downsides of more pressure on real estate, more pressure on schools, things like that. So it's actually a bit of a sticky political situation for the provincial government.
It is. No two ways about it. Yeah. Well, we should maybe just jump back for a moment here to Prime Minister Carney. Now, he's on record saying he wants to make Canada an energy superpower. Sounds good, right? But what are you hearing from Alberta's energy sector on that, considering, again, his long-term track record on climate change and being vehemently really against fossil fuel development? So how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, they're sort of cautiously optimistic. I mean, I suppose if you're in any sort of business sector, you don't want to come out the day or two after the election and say, this is like a disaster of colossal proportions. That would you're not going to get very much from a government going with that route, I think. But they're cautiously optimistic. They're saying that, look, he said some of the right things on the campaign trail in terms of energy corridors and in terms of growing conventional energy. In addition to clean energy, he actually mentioned conventional energy in his election night speech. And it was this really funny moment. He said, we're gonna make Canada into a clean and conventional energy sort of superpower. And there's a bit of a pause in the audience, and then they started applauding as if they heard conventional energy and thought, "Ooh, don't know if we should be cheering for that." But the energy sector is basically saying, "Look, we felt like we heard some of the right things, but now we're waiting to see what policy changes actually are in effect, whether this is all talk or if there's going to be any action to support the sector or give the sector more of an opportunity to grow."
And that's what it comes down to. It's words versus actions, right? And, so he's got an opportunity to prove himself here. Will he or won't he? I guess. Well, I mean, again, if you're a business investor in the oil and gas sector, you're coming into Alberta. The only way you're going to risk your money is if you feel confident that there's an environment there that you're going to get some bang for your buck, some return on your investment. And if it's not, then why would you invest your money in there if you're not sure where things are at or where they're going to be going? And again, we're talking about Bill C-69, right? The No More Pipelines Act, essentially, or the Impact Assessment Act, technically. But, right, will those timelines for approval on new projects actually be reduced? Carney's been saying, well, okay, it's been taking, an average of 5 years, 6 years, whatever. Now we're going to make sure it only takes 2 years. Well, I guess time will tell if that happens. And I think we're the only major oil exporting nation with that kind of policy. So it puts us at a competitive disadvantage to all these other nations around the world, right? So, I'm assuming they're going to be looking for some concrete policy changes. And if it doesn't happen, then I guess it's more of the status quo, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that does seem to be. I think that's exactly right.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Real briefly, by the way, I'm up against the clock here, but Christina Gray, Alberta NDP MLA, she was going to introduce that legislation on tips, like at the restaurant sort of thing, hospitality places, staying with the workers, not going to business owners or management. But the UCP voted that down. So what's the logic behind that?
Who knows? I mean, the strange thing about this is it seemed to have support from the Alberta Hospitality Association, sort of the industry group. Business owners seemed more or less fine with it. It certainly would have increased earnings for, quote unquote, the little guy. I don't really know. If I was the NDP, I'd be socking this away for the next election to bring it up
sure.
at every possible
I just scratched my head on that one. I'm going, okay, maybe there's more to this that I'm not hearing or seeing, but no. I thought that should be a win-win. But anyway, well, thanks so much for your time again, Tyler.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.